Hello and welcome to the Taxcast from the Tax Justice Network, a monthly podcast about corruption, tax abuse, financial secrecy and how we fix it. I'm Naomi Fowler. Coming up later, a tiny group of wealthy people are burning through carbon like there'll be no tomorrow.
Luxury private jet use yachts are something that people really care about. It makes them very angry. But the emissions embedded in what the wealthy own vastly outweighs the dimension of what they personally use.
We talked to economist Tasnia Hussain, who's modelled the best tax policies to address carbon inequality and reduce emissions. Before that, Washington state in the United States has passed a wealth tax. The state actually had no income tax, so it's been struggling with healthcare and school costs. What they now have is a state-level income tax of 9.9% for income over $1 million. Your first million is tax-free. There'll be a court challenge. And we know wealthy people can, if they want, reduce the amount of income they receive and tuck away the rest as assets in other entities accumulating value there. But all change in this direction is a good thing, and this is something to celebrate. The South Korean president has publicly criticised the Korean Chamber of Commerce for citing the widely discredited Henley and Partners report. That's the report that's been behind endless inaccurate global news stories about millionaires leaving countries because they're being taxed too much. The president referenced the Tax Justice Network's debunking of these myths, saying, quote, "Deliberate fake news that tries to cloud the judgment of sovereign people who make policies is an enemy of democracy." Absolutely. For more on those dodgy claims, listen to episode 155 of the Taxcast, the Millionaire Exodus Myth. The link's in the show notes. And we're going to take a look at some of the highlights in New York, where the world's nations came together recently at the United Nations to take the next steps towards a UN tax convention.
Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of civil society, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to the fourth session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee for the United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. The documents before you reflect long hours.
These 8 days of negotiations were part of an ongoing historic effort to overturn a century of global tax rule setting, rules set largely by former imperial powers at the OECD to suit them and their multinationals. So it's a chance for governments across the world to tax business being done in their country fairly and to stop bleeding tax revenue. But not all the world's nations were there. The United States walked out of the talks last year in 2025. And before these latest UN negotiations got started, two very different camps were once again very clear. On the one hand, at the United Nations, countries negotiated openly and multilaterally at the UN headquarters in New York. And on the other hand, behind closed doors, there were bilateral demands and threats from the United States against other countries. The result of that was about a month before this latest United Nations session, 150 governments announced they'd agreed a so-called side-by-side deal with the United States, which exempts US multinationals from most elements of the global minimum corporate tax of 15%. That global minimum tax was supposed to stop multinational corporations, so very often US multinationals, from shifting profits to low or no tax havens. So the question for those governments is, how much tax revenue did the United States bully you into giving up? We already know that the UK and the Netherlands are likely to have lost themselves 25% of expected tax revenues. South Africa apparently expects a revenue reduction of 75%. And it all goes to show why these always underreported UN negotiations are so important and why the Africa Group of Nations is leading the charge for global tax rules to be decided collectively and more democratically. Here's Navid Hanif, UN Assistant Secretary General, explaining what's at stake right at the start of the talks.
Let me start by saying this clearly. Getting to this point has taken an extraordinary effort. And I want to acknowledge the outstanding leadership by the co-chair, members of the Bureau and the co-leads. The documents before you reflect long hours of technical and legal work. They reflect close cooperation across delegations. That commitment matters. It speaks to the seriousness with which member states are engaging in this process. Allow me to highlight 3 issues as we begin today. First, where we are in the process. We are entering a crucial phase. From the start, this negotiation was designed to move in stages. 2025 was about scoping, about defining the building blocks. 2026 is about drafting. And 2027 is where the final political decisions will be taken. This session marks the pivot from scoping to drafting. We are on schedule, and we are moving toward the next major milestone, the preparation of the zero draft this year. Second, the opportunity before us. This convention is not simply about filling gaps in the existing system. It is an historic opportunity. For the first time, we have the chance to build a truly universal framework for international tax cooperation. One that reflects the realities of today's global economy. If we get this right, the impact will be real and big. It can help curb illicit financial flows. It can help ensure that multinational enterprises pay taxes where economic activity actually takes place. And it can strengthen domestic revenues, where even modest gains can translate into major development impact. Our task is to create a framework that is fit for the 21st century, a framework shaped by the shared priorities of all member states. Third and finally, multilateralism that must guide us. International tax cooperation goes to the heart of national sovereignty. It affects how states finance development, and it touches directly on sensitive policy choices. That is precisely why this process matters. It must reflect the United Nations' distinctive approach to multilateralism: open, inclusive, transparent, and grounded in mutual respect.
It is always fascinating to watch these UN sessions where, unlike with the OECD, all nations are at the table and can speak and vote. Also present and able to speak is so-called civil society, also known as stakeholders. That includes NGOs like ours that research and campaign on economic, social and tax justice, community groups, organisations that are independent from the state and from commerce. At the United Nations, we saw once again OECD member states trying to slow down progress despite the common interests that really should make stronger agreements possible for them. Here's Ryad Selmani from the NGO Terre Solidaire addressing delegates.
We have witnessed exclusive clubs of wealthy nations, no need here to give names, systematically overlooking harmful practices within their own borders, fueling again and again a global race to the bottom. We have the impression that OECD countries are so narrowly focused on defending the OECD system that it creates a deepening north-south divide in this room. Furthermore, several OECD countries in the room seem to overlook their own economic interests and forget that they are losing economic resources due to harmful tax practices. The fact of the matter is that UN-defined global rules against harmful tax practices is in the interest of the mass majority of the countries in the room.
International negotiations of any kind are always messy, but watching attempts at inclusive multilateral cooperation at the United Nations, you can see that this is a genuine attempt to rebalance power globally, and these are life and death decisions that affect people's lives. There was strong pressure for governments to agree to incorporate into the text specific measures against carbon emitters and to recognise historical responsibilities for carbon emissions. Jamaica's representative expressed the fears of countries like hers on the front line of climate change, that commitments aren't yet strong enough. Jamaica's still recovering from Hurricane Melissa just a few months ago.
We would have wanted to see language that spoke more directly to the issue of international tax cooperation and the link to these goals. We are being told that there will be a protocol at some point. There will be the conference of parties. But as we speak, Chair, the issue of climate change and environmental taxes environmental issues are very live to some countries. And I don't need to mention my own and our recent experience. And of course, when that happens, in our case, it was 40% of our economy that disappeared. And so we are now back into the spiral and the bowels of debt financing. And perhaps that is what we ought to be discussing, because you see, as long as we delay the issues concerning the relationship between international tax cooperation and environmental issues in particular, then it means that countries who are being impacted will just continue to, every 6 months, to be going through this whole issue of trying to rebuild before you are affected by yet another climate disaster. It really brings to mind the part of a song that my countryman Bob Marley sang. And in it he says that, well, for us, sustainable development, and I'm adding my own mix to it, will just be a fleeting illusion to be pursued but never attained. And we regret that this convention would have missed the opportunity to be revolutionary and to assist countries in actually attaining sustainable development.
Here's the representative of the Youth Forum also pushing for member states to craft international tax rules fit for an age of climate catastrophe.
Youth participation in this process is important and increasing. We engage in this process because we believe that the Convention has immense potential to unlock public revenues for social and environmental action, reduce inequalities and hold corporate and wealthy polluters to account for their environmental damages. This starts now, not in a future hypothetical protocol, now in the Convention. And what better way to start than by operationalising the polluters pay principle?
The polluter pays principle makes entities producing pollution responsible for bearing the costs of managing, preventing and putting right the damage they've done.
If the UN Tax Convention does not enshrine it, we are missing a fundamental opportunity. This principle is long established in international, regional and national frameworks, from the Rio Declaration to the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. Environmental responsibility is not optional. It is a legal and moral duty, and it must therefore be at the core of the architecture of an international tax system worthy of the 21st century. The second cornerstone of international environmental and climate law that is lacking from this draft is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Countries differ in their capacities and, of course, in their historical responsibilities, and there's no reason for this principle to be absent from this convention. We are concerned. Young people are watching. Will you be able to deliver?
Surprisingly, a group of nations led by the UK, supported by Germany, Brazil and Sweden, pushed to strengthen the text on the polluter pays principle, so that was interesting. There was also lots of debate on how far the UN Tax Convention should go to embed enforceable standards in its core text now, or postpone substance to later negotiations. The most concrete proposals, of course, came from the Africa Group and other G77 members. Not surprising, as those are the nations most exposed to unfair global tax rules. Here's Ryad Selmani again from Terre Solidaire addressing the UN delegates.
Cooperation without compliance is not cooperation. If agreed standards are optional, or if non-cooperative jurisdictions face no consequences, harmful practices will persist. The overall architecture of this convention must therefore rest on a strong legal foundation supported by robust, transparent, and collectively agreed compliance mechanisms. Finally, we must reject the false dichotomy between cooperation and sovereignty. True sovereignty is the ability of a state to fund its own development free from the tax-dodging strategies of multinational enterprises and the secrecy of non-cooperative jurisdictions. This convention offers a historic opportunity to build a tax system where every country's right to tax is protected through shared rules, mutual accountability, and genuine multilateralism. Even on tax matters, cooperation is not a limitation on sovereignty, it is its necessary condition.
So, after these 8 days of negotiations, draft texts are now being prepared. The next negotiation phase will really test how far governments will translate some of the ambitions we've heard about here into enforceable commitments. The next meeting to discuss this at the United Nations is in August 2026. The final text is due for adoption by the United Nations in autumn 2027. We'll be following that here on the Taxcast and keeping you up to date. We'll be back after this.
In the shadow of power, in one of the richest cities on earth, a man dies, homeless and unseen. Julia Remesh died in an underpass in Westminster, just meters away from the buildings that govern Britain. Around him were empty homes, dark, locked, untouched. How can someone lose everything in the heart of so much wealth? Follow that question and it leads to a hidden world of money, secrecy and power. A system that decides who gets a home and who doesn't.
This is the kind of place where that relationship between dirty money in the city and the kind of dark money that goes into the political machine kind of meet.
Where could this lead? Where does it end? What else can we become desensitized to?
I'm Kojo Karam, writer and researcher, and since 2018, this story has haunted me. Death in Westminster is a 4-part series from Novara Media, produced by Planet B Productions.
We're back. Okay. A few years ago, a student called Jack Sweeney got himself into hot water for, quite legally, tracking the private jets and carbon outputs of celebrities, which are publicly available, and publishing them on social media. Jack Sweeney was posting Taylor Swift's flight information on X, or Twitter handle SwiftJet next day. And as that name suggests, he was publishing it the following day rather than in real time. That didn't stop Taylor Swift from making legal threats against him.
It sure is scary at times. You know, several days before I received the letter from Swift's team, there was many articles about her jet emissions. And I really think with her specifically, I think it's really towards the jet emissions is what it's really about, and trying to hide that.
Swift has previously been named the #1 celebrity CO2 polluter, and her emissions claimed to be 1,100 times the amount of the average person. Here's Jack's lawyer defending him in a TV interview.
There is no legal claim here. This is just public information, and he's not using it in a nefarious way. And this is him tracking jets, and there's a purpose. These jets are emitting an insane amount of carbon emissions.
Taylor Swift says she offsets all the carbon she's burning through by buying carbon credits. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole. All of this got economist and PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, Tasnia Hussain, thinking about how tax can most effectively reduce carbon emissions and address carbon inequality.
Everybody, I think, is aware of what income inequality, wealth inequality is that there are some people who earn a lot more income and a lot more wealth than the majority of the population. And carbon inequality is in a similar vein, where there are a small group of individuals who have disproportionate carbon footprints relative to their size.
As the news coverage about Taylor Swift versus Jack Sweeney boiled up, Tasnia got to work.
I started digging into what the literature on this inequality and carbon footprints across individuals was saying. So the wealthy emit through 2 channels. The first is the one that's visible, it's right there, and it's that they consume in this highly carbon intensive way through private jet use and their yachts. So that is the one that we all know about. But the ways in which they generate their income and their wealth can also be polluting through the ownership of polluting firms and assets. It's really important to consider these 2 sources of accounting for emissions. So targeting private jet use and yachts is definitely important, but the bulk of the carbon footprint of wealthy individuals is coming through this second channel. And so imposing a tax on these ownership-related emissions is an important policy tool that I think also needed to be considered.
I know, it's tempting to focus on private jet emissions and tax those to high heaven, and we should do that. But We shouldn't miss the bigger picture, is what Tasnia is saying.
If you only look at this consumption-based approach alone, then the wealthy, or the top 0.1% of wealth in the US, account for 2% of US emissions. But when you also consider their ownership of polluting firms and assets, this number jumps sevenfold to 15%. And so emissions are extremely concentrated amongst wealthy individuals. And that's where the start of my paper really came about, is how do I build a model that can capture both of these dimensions of carbon inequality, and then I can create this laboratory where I can investigate the implications of using different types of taxation to reduce emissions and also curb carbon inequality.
I'm going to simplify a lot here, but Tasnia created a model to test how effective 3 main tax policies targeting reduction in carbon emissions actually are. The first one is a basic consumption tax applied to all households and their emissions from everyday energy use like heating and commuting to work. Second, a luxury consumption tax that targets emissions from carbon-intensive stuff like private jets and super yachts. You could maybe call it a SWIFT tax. And third, a production emissions tax that targets businesses.
I wanted to create a laboratory where I could investigate the implications of these kind of taxes. And so the main question that I wanted to ask is, how does a government that has to meet an abatement goal decide which sources of emissions to target? The truth is we are close to hitting critical climate thresholds, and passing these thresholds comes with devastating consequences. And so the question is, what sources of emissions do we want to target? And so I built a model of the whole economy. Let's say we want to reduce emissions by 10%. What is the least painful way of accomplishing this? And what effect does that have across the wealth distribution? Are low-income households going to be worse off under this policy? Is there a way that we can improve their outcomes? And how are very rich households as well going to react to this kind of policy? So the first thing that I do is, luxury private jet use, yachts are something that people really, really care about. It makes them very angry. So get rid of them entirely and see what happens. I share that anger, right? Like when you see the private jet use, it's right there. You see a celebrity standing beside their 2 jets. A tax on these kind of goods feels like, okay, we're getting to the root of the problem. We're getting to the root of where carbon inequality is coming from. And I think it's part of the story, but the emissions embedded in what the wealthy own vastly outweighs the dimension of what they personally use. The first thing I find is that so few people are consuming these types of things that eliminating them entirely actually cannot achieve meaningful abatement. So emissions drop by very little when I eliminate them completely. And so that's what was counterintuitive, that the real way of targeting carbon inequality is in something that was a lot more hidden. I think when we think about carbon inequality of rich individual, the image that comes to mind is the private jet, is the yachts. It's harder to visualize the emissions that are embedded in the assets that they own or their stocks.
And remember, Tasnia's challenge was to find the taxes that are best at bringing emissions down and addressing carbon inequality. Fairness has to be a real thing that people can feel, and that feeds a political consensus to transition away from fossil fuels faster.
When we think about a carbon tax, the type that has been implemented in Canada and in Europe, there is literature suggesting that these types of carbon taxes disproportionately burden low-income households. So this explains a lot of the political unrest. And in Canada recently, we had to get rid of it ahead of our federal election because there was no appetite for it. Because the tax was making life more unaffordable. You're at the gas pumps and you're really feeling it. Heat your home. People didn't really care that they were getting these rebates back in the bank. A lot of people actually felt like they were getting back rebates that didn't fully compensate them, even though they were actually getting back larger rebates. And I think a world in which we consider how to tax carbon in a way that also addresses carbon inequality, I think it's going to garner a lot more support. So my hope is that there is more buy-in for carbon pricing, and it's not something that you have to make, if you care about the environment, that means you have to not care about the affordability crisis anymore. but that carbon pricing can be a tool that perhaps makes life more affordable for people as well with the cheaper energy that's coming about. The other thing I found really surprising and counterintuitive is that when you tax production emissions, GDP declines. And so you would think, okay, everybody across the wealth distribution is going to hate this. Low income, wealthy households alike are going to dislike this policy. And they don't.
What's really significant about Tasnia's modelling work is that it captures the chain reactions of a tax policy.
So the chain reaction that's happening in this model is you're taxing the firm on their energy use. It's going to first force firms to contract their activity. That makes sense. The chain reaction that happens is you reduce energy demand, and this brings down energy prices. And that's something that all households across the wealth distribution are going to like. For the low-income household, it's now cheaper to heat your home. And that's something that people really care about, and especially given the fact that we're in this huge affordability crisis right now. But what was really surprising to me is that even for rich individuals, they valued the fact that it's now cheaper to heat your home if you have multiple homes, and private jet fuel is also cheaper. And so the thing that's surprising with the production emissions tax is they're going to be using more luxury goods. So they're going to be, flying their private jets more. They're going to be using their yachts more. And on the surface, that looks horrible. But behind the scenes, carbon inequality actually declined because you've targeted where the bulk of their carbon footprint actually lies. So you might be seeing, more pictures of celebrities flying their private jets, but the emissions from their wealth generation is actually lower. That's what was really counterintuitive.
So, Tasnia found the most effective tax policy for reducing emissions and carbon inequality is all about targeting ownership of the crisis we're facing. We've talked about who owns the climate crisis before on the Taxcast in episode 134. The link's in the show notes. That's worth a listen. Back to Tasnia.
The production emissions tax for moderate levels of abatement is the most effective approach that we can take. How does it compare to the luxury good tax? It reduces carbon inequality by 3 times more. The reason why is that for the top 0.1% of wealth, these ownership emissions is where the bulk of their carbon footprint is coming from. It's more effective. It's kind of like the iceberg analogy where we're just seeing the tip, and the bottom that's hidden away is the emissions in their wealth and their assets. And that is what we should really be focusing on targeting, as well as like the top of the iceberg. I'm not saying that we shouldn't tax private jet use at all. I think it's part of the solution, but not the only part.
My thanks to Tasnia Hussain of the University of Toronto. Her paper is called Optimal Carbon Policy Under Carbon Inequality. It's in the show notes. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with you soon. Bye for now.